Yeah, man, there's so much outside of our control. And the way that interacts with drugs is really fascinating. Like you mentioned the way, the manner of using that to discover more about ourselves. And that is also the way in which I think more like risks can come about with drugs as well. This is modern day Hippie. We are your homies who've done nearly every drug under the sun. Over 600 psychedelic trips and nearly every kind of bender you can possibly imagine have armed us with a universe of knowledge. I'm Yuki, and with my co-host Reggie, we talk about how we do drugs in a responsible, safe, and fun way to improve our lives. Before we dive in, and so we don't get sued, a quick legal disclaimer.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Our goal is to educate and inform others about the realities of substance use in an engaging and entertaining format. We share these experiences so you can learn from them without trying them yourself. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to attempt to recreate anything found in this episode or in any of our other content. We are not confessing to any acts stated in this podcast. The content in this episode should not be treated as factual or real in any way.
With that, we welcome you through our portal and hope you enjoy the show. What's up, hippies? Hope you're having a vibey day so far. It's your boys Yuki and Reggie here, coming at you with another heater. Reggie, what you got cooking for us today?
Man, so this past weekend, Yuki, I felt like I needed a reset, So I was looking around, looking at my options of what kind of drugs that I had, psychedelics specifically, and I knew I wanted to trip, and I was like, acid might be a bit much right now, just like time-wise. I don't know if I have the time for it. But the shrooms that I have, 3 types of shrooms, I had 2 different types of chocolate, and then I had some raw mushrooms. And honestly, dude, I feel like my tolerance to the chocolate mushrooms, or maybe not even my tolerance, but my distolerance to the taste of them is so bad right now. Like, I feel like throwing up by just even thinking about eating these chocolate mushrooms. And that's ridiculous to me because they used to be like so good tasting. Like, you know what I mean? They're all flavored and shit, and like they taste great, but I don't know. I guess like our bodies just know that this shit like fucks with us. And so like now the thought of just eating any of that chocolate just fucks me up. So I tried to eat like some shrooms chocolates, and I couldn't get myself to do it. Like I literally like unwrapped it as soon as I smelled it. I was like, nope, it's not happening. And so what I ended up doing was I took all the raw shrooms I had left, which I had a decent amount, probably like 5-6 grams. And I just made a tea, like I threw them in the fucking magic bullet blender, grinded them up, put them in a little tea bag thing, and then just like made some tea. And I couldn't taste them at all, which I was so surprised because I was like, I thought that like even in a tea form, like, and I've had shrooms tea before, don't get me wrong, but I've never made it myself. So I wasn't sure how it would go. I've always had someone else making it with me, or like someone else would make it for me type of thing. But yeah, dude, couldn't taste it at all. Like no like gross tasting reaction from it or anything. But anyways, so I drank a bunch of shrooms tea, and I also took these edibles that I got from like the smoke shop, and they were like Delta 9 CBD, like 1-to-1 ratio. So I took a decent amount of that, and then I smoked a little bit of weed because I was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna do this. And then I just, did my thing, like just went about my day, watched TV, like hung out with a homie. Dude, I don't know if it's like all the things that like just like me like dealing with life recently, or just like all the things going on in my life like personally, but man, the combination of that shit made me so fucking anxious, dude. And like not like in like a bad way, but like in like my body physically has so much anxiety right now. Like I could feel the anxiety. And so I started like, in hindsight after that, I like kind of like started digging into it a bit. And like, I think a lot of that had to do with the weed. Apparently like studies show that at low doses, like THC is actually like good for anxiety, but then at higher doses, it like increases your anxiety. CBD apparently at all the doses that are tested is supposed to reduce your anxiety, but I guess I didn't have too much CBD. And then shrooms or psychedelics are supposed to help you with anxiety, but like we all know having trips that like it is very much one of those things that will help you long term, but in the moment like you might be freaking out, or like you might be chilling, or whatever it is, like something's going on in your brain, And the whole reason I bring all this up is because it wasn't like a bad trip or anything, but because the next day I experienced the kind of like mental clarity and peace that I legit have never experienced before. And I don't know if it was because I went from like so such a high anxiety state to like the opposite the next day. But like literally the next day, I was chilling so fucking hard. Like I went to work, dude. I like went to the office and I'm like sitting in a meeting and someone's like talking like on like the speaker, like on Zoom or whatever. And then like all the rest of the people like are in the room are just like sitting there and it's like so quiet. And like I just kind of was like focused on what they were saying and everything outside of that like was silent. And I could hear the silence and it was so peaceful.
Wow.
And what kind of fucked that up for me a little bit and what made me realize like the external factors for how you're feeling is that during that meeting, like right before that meeting, I went and got like a large coffee just because I was like getting coffee with coworkers or whatever. And so I started sipping on it about halfway through the meeting. And by the end of the meeting, I could feel some of that peace kind of being like drained away from me a little bit.
Oh,
You know, like my heart
no.
rate was just a little bit higher than I wanted it to be. The caffeine was definitely hitting me. And it might have not even been all the caffeine. It might have been the sugar or a combination of the sugar and the caffeine. So it was like some sugary coffee drink, you know? And I was like, it just really got me thinking, man. I'm like, damn, dude, like there's so much that can affect the way that you're feeling that you might not even be aware of. And it really got me thinking about a conversation that you and I have had before around like how in control of your mood and things around you are you really, or can you even really be? And I think people might try to use drugs to control some of that, but I don't even think that's the way that I see drugs. I see drugs as exposing a lot of that, like as a tool to help me better understand myself. I don't know. I feel like you have some thoughts on this before. I've been rambling, my bad.
No, dude. This is awesome. Definitely something I've been thinking about as well. But interestingly, from the angle of kind of like Buddhism and spirituality, um, been learning a lot more about just kind of foundational Buddhist beliefs. And one of like the core elements about the human like experience that Buddhism kind of encourages its followers to really internalize is the fact that the concept of the self is completely an illusion. Because if we were to be like a self, then that self would be in complete control of who we are. And so, you could potentially say the self is our body. The self is the voice in our heads. The self is our perception of our surroundings. But in none of these cases are we like fully in control over what's happening. And so really in a lot of ways, like, our bodies are animals or machines or whatever way you want to think about it. But, they react to external stimuli in ways that like sometimes we can predict and sometimes we can't. And that especially applies, on the levels of like emotions and psychology.
Yeah.
And yeah, man, I mean, there's so many really vital like nutrients in your body and elements in your body that can really rule how you feel. And I honestly feel like I've been on a bit of a journey of being less like hard on myself, or less just not blaming myself as much if I'm like not feeling great, at a specific moment or on a specific night. Like, if I'm feeling tired during a work day, or I'm not really feeling the vibes and like a night out or whatever, just kind of giving myself the space to feel that way.
Just the grace. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
important,
and not
dude.
like beating yourself up for it. And, just the only true constant in life is change, and the fact that like everything is temporary. It's like those feelings will pass. And there are definitely days when I'm like, damn, man, like I don't feel great. It's probably just a day thing. That's okay. I'll wake up tomorrow feeling fine, or even feel fine later. But yeah, man, there's so much outside of our control. And the way that interacts with drugs is, I think, really fascinating. Like you mentioned the way, the manner of using that to discover more about ourselves. And that is also the way in which I think more like risks can come about with drugs as well. Like how people have different proclivities to getting maybe like addicted to certain substances, or reacting negatively to things like psychedelics or things like that, where there's always like a small chance of that happening. And I think some people are just much more predisposed to it, which is really unfortunate. But yeah, man, we don't know what we don't know. And the final thing on this front that I want to share is that I've also become increasingly aware of how disconnected our mind really is from our body. And it's this whole idea that like our body knows things that our brain can like not even comprehend. And I've really experienced this in like recent months, where I've gone through a bit, honestly, a lot of like a spiritual just like moments, like this like spiritual like rebirth or something, or honestly just birthing. And they're just specific like just thoughts and concepts that I've come up with that have just like made me like bawl my eyes out in a way that I haven't cried in like years. And like I'm not someone who cries often at all. And it really feels like my body like releasing things that it's been holding on to. It's
It's real,
crazy.
bro.
Like
There's like science behind that, like gut feelings and shit like that. Like that's super real. Like they call it the second brain, you know?
exactly.
Like your body, your organs and shit is like your second brain, and it can detect things that like your first brain is not necessarily aware of, like consciously, right? So
Yeah, yeah, no, and the gut specifically, there's billions of bacteria that live in each of our
right.
guts. And granted, you know, you're probably like, ah, bacteria, whatever. Like they don't know shit, which obviously they're not human brains, but like, bro, billions of organisms. Like, I don't know, man. That's a lot. And this is really where I try to temper my like, you know, the line between just scientific provable things and things that are a little bit more woo and spiritual. And honestly, I'm finding what that like balance is for myself personally. But I do believe that there's definitely something to it. And I think I'm starting
It's
to
all
embrace.
connected, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm starting to embrace a little bit more that like there are just some things that we cannot explain. And I think I naively used to think that you could explain everything through some science, some math, like at its core. But I think the further I get into life and the more just really crazy things I experience that hinge a lot on just like connections with other people and like certain feelings that I have, it really just gives me the sense I'm like, damn, there's so much more at play here that like
Dude, yeah.
there,
Even if it
there's
could be explained, even if there is an explanation, it doesn't mean that we have the ability to even comprehend it. You know what I mean?
yeah, exactly. And honestly, like in recent, I would say in the last like year of me doing drugs recreationally, one of my biggest gratitudes has been the way in which drugs have like really opened me to more of these experiences to like, you know, in some cases having them very actively. Like, dude, some of the realizations that I had during like a DMT trip, I would take some notes like mid trip, just jot them down on my phone, like without even thinking. And the next day I would revisit them and dude, some of these thoughts would like, those are the things that would just make me start like, they would unlock something in me and I would just start like bawling my eyes out.
It's a powerful tool, man.
And
I was at the gym like last week and I was in the sauna and I was talking to this guy. He was telling me about how he took DMT and he broke through super hard. He just like realized how poorly he's been treating his mom. And like after that, like his relationship with his mom like got so much stronger. I'm like, dude, that's fucking amazing.
wow.
Like, and it's like, and like that obviously like that's been bothering him on a level that he wasn't even aware of. You know what I mean? And God knows how it's been influencing him, like, and influencing his behavior. But through like that tool of like DMT in this case, he was able to kind of like, I don't even know what the right terminology is, like mix his subconscious with his conscious, bring them together so that he can explore what's actually going on in his head, in his body, in his mind, and deal with it, you know? And like he did. And then he was telling me how his relationship with his mom so much better. It was a big realization for him. It was just like an epiphany, like a breakthrough.
Yeah, no. And as we've talked about before on the show, it's like psychedelics in particular can really show you some inner workings of your brain that you may not be aware of like at all. And I know especially ones that can take you pretty deep, things like DMT, like ayahuasca, can really kind of throw the lid
Yeah.
off of things and really challenge like, you know, your mindsets, perspectives, thoughts, like memories. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, dude. But instead of us talking about what we can't control, because there's a lot that's like that influences what we do and that we like legitimately have no control, maybe not even awareness over, right? Like, even like things like anxiety and depression, like have a genetic component to it. Like you have no control over that. What foods you're eating is largely influenced by like where you live, what foods you have access to. You largely don't have control over what you have access to, right? But you do have control over what you choose to eat that you do have access to. So I feel like using like with using these drugs, like it's helped me realize that even though we don't have control over a lot of things and like our moods and our feelings, there is a level of control that we do have. And I think focusing on just like what is within our control and legitimately not worrying about what's out of our control is already going to help with like the anxiety, and it's going to help with the feeling of control, frankly, because everyone wants to feel like they're in control of their lives, even though like let's be real here. None of us are really in control of our lives. Like, we are to an extent, but like on a macro level, like, we're not, dude. Like, we're
No,
just not.
absolutely not.
Like, if a war broke out right now, like, what are we as an individual going to do to stop it? I don't know. Maybe there are people out there who have more influence or power, but like, speaking generally here, like, we can't control what the planet does. For example, like, nobody here is stopping climate change, right? Like, so instead of focusing on all those things that like we can't do, we can focus on the small amount of things that we can do, that we do have control over, and just having that realization and like being easier on yourself in that way is like, I feel like it's so huge. And it reminds me a lot of, you know, that book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck? I feel like they talk about that a lot in that book as well. And like, I didn't really understand fully what the author was trying to say until I kind of like did some reflection with the drugs, to be honest, with the psychedelics and some of the weed. And even like, and I think I've talked about it on the pod a little bit before, but even like taking an upper, like Adderall or caffeine, like what I was just mentioning, has a profound effect on like the way that you're interacting with people and behaving. Like, you might not even realize it. Especially like, I see it all the time in like the business world. People like, before they have their coffee or after they have their coffee, completely different people, you know? Like, that shit's real.
Hey hippies, we hope you're enjoying the show so far. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and are having a good time, you need to come over to YouTube and subscribe to the Modern Day Hippie YouTube channel. We publish exclusive video content, and I promise you the experience is richer and more interesting. So if you're getting any value at all, stop what you're doing, open up the YouTube app, and subscribe at Modern Day Hippie. If you're watching this on YouTube and aren't subscribed yet, what are you doing? Go press subscribe. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. To me, it all comes down to the fact that I really think that like happiness and just life satisfaction is very much a state of mind. And obviously there are some parameters there that, you need to have a roof over your head and need to be fed and
Right.
have those basic needs met. But it's like beyond that, I mean, I interact with a lot of very successful people, very like, financially well off, very high powered people. I read even more about these people, and it's like there are just as many unhappy, truly miserable millionaires and even billionaires as there are just like normal average people. And it's like, past a pretty low point of just being able to like care for yourself and your family, it really is just all in your head. And that's definitely been like, my biggest takeaway from drugs in particular is like just reminding myself of that fact. And a lot of these, like, honestly, a big part of the reason why I do drugs and I enjoy doing drugs is because of the relationships and the connections that it helps me create with other people. And at the end of the day, like, life really comes down to the relationships in your life. Like,
yeah, and you're not even talking like business connections, like how people say
No.
oh, like connections. You're talking about like legitimate, person to person connections.
Yeah, like do you have
I know exactly what you mean.
people who you love? Are there people who love you? And it's like, I mean, there's been so many studies done on this and books written where it's like they literally talk to people on their deathbeds, and it's like, what do you think back on? What do you regret? What made your life? And every single time, it's like the relationships, my friends, my family, and honestly, like, dude, I've experienced this so viscerally the last 6 months. Like, I have come upon like this new like quality and depth of relationships in my life with like so many new friends who I've met, with people who I've known for a relatively short amount of time, but just like the depth of these relationships, I'm like, dude, this is what life is all about. And a couple episodes ago, I talked about that awesome burner wedding I went to in Cabo, and just that feeling of like truly feeling like I have found my family and that we're all on the same page and the amount of love we have for each other. Like, man, I left that experience truly telling myself that like, this is the greatest feeling in the world. This is like what, like, to me, this is it in life. And I think that could vary a little bit from person to person, but I really think on the whole that like having those rewarding relationships is a huge part of just like happiness. And to tie that in with drugs, like, I really enjoy doing drugs with other people. Like, I'll do them alone every once in a while, but something I've honestly allowed myself to do more of is just share my drugs, like, for free. Like, just giving out drugs to people. And that's something I used to not do because it's like, oh, I kind of want them for myself. I spent a lot of money on these, whatever. And part of it is, now I'm financially better off. I can afford to do that, which is a privilege for sure. But dude, there have been times recently where I would just give out drugs that I'm not even taking, and it just brings me so much joy, man. I'm like, obviously it's an easy way to make friends. It's a fucking easy way to make friends to just give out drugs to people. But man, it just makes the experience so human. And at the end of the day, we're all just freaking specks on this rock hurtling through space, and we can just find ways to kind of vibe with each other and have a good time and maybe learn a thing or two from one another. That is really it. I think that's all that quote unquote matters, at least in my head, at the end of the day. Yeah. And honestly, a lot of this conversation takes me back to years ago, honestly, probably when I was in high school and mainly college, when I got really into learning about stoicism, and some of the main principles being there that, like, yeah, most things are out of your control. So just focus on the things that are in your control. And the fact that if you zoom out far enough, like, nothing really matters in life. And I think at first glance, that concept that nothing matters sounds pretty depressing. But I think the deeper you dig into it, the more that concept will set you free. That's definitely what it did for me, because I'm like, okay, if nothing really matters, then it's kind of just up to me. Like, I can make whatever things I want, like, matter to me. And I think that's very much just like a journey of, like, figuring out what that is for each of us.
Yeah, and people have different takes. Like, I'm religious, so, like, I have my religious views on it, but I don't find that ever conflicts with what I've learned when I'm, like, on drugs, you know what I mean? Or, like, learn about myself or even about others. And I still subscribe to a lot of the same kind of philosophies that we've kind of talked about here. And it's really interesting hearing the different ways that people describe a lot of these things. Like, recently I heard someone say that they measure happiness by the difference between expectation and reality. Like, the gap between expectation and reality is where you're going to find
reality minus expectations. I was just talking to a friend about that.
Is that the formula? Is that a thing?
Yep. Dude, it is truly one of the, like, most real and accurate and true formulas about life. Like, it's so simple but so true. Like, I mean, think about a time you had really high expectations for something, whether it was like a trip, a meal, a relationship. You know, when you create this false narrative in your head and then you're met with reality, like, if your false narrative is really, really positive, then, like, reality will never match that. You know, that's why it's not good to, like, overly romanticize relationships with people or certain experiences. Whereas some of the happiest people I know in my life, like, they have so little expectations. They just show up, they just vibe, they're, like, down for whatever, like, wherever things go. And they are consistently just, like, very pleasantly surprised.
Dude, that's such a vibe.
Dude, it is truly. Yeah. And, like, that's something I'm very actively trying to embrace. And I'm like, yeah, this is kind of the way to do it, man. Like,
yeah. And I feel like that ties back to what we were talking about before, where it's like, you know, there's all these different factors that are going to affect you that are out of your control. But, like, once you accept that they're out of your control, then your expectations go down, and that your expectations going down will thus make you pleasantly surprised so much more often, which is kind of like the place to be, in my opinion. Like, you want to be that guy who's like, you want to be always, like, randomly happy as opposed to, like, disappointed all the time. Like, those people are the ones who, like, end up getting, like, you know, I can't speak for generally, but, like, a lot of those people, like, they end up getting depressed, or they end up just being sad about, like, things that, like, wouldn't make someone with a different perspective or a different mindset sad. Like, so yeah, I guess maybe we do have a little more control over how we feel than.
Honestly, it's all in your head.
It's all in your head,
to an extent, like,
to an extent.
It really is. Yeah. And then the last thing I want to say on this, and to tie this back into drugs, is that something I've been trying to be more intentional about is, you know, I've had so many drug experiences at this point that really put me in that frame of mind of just happiness and satisfaction with, like, my life and the world, and just put me in this very pleasant state of mind. And obviously when the drugs were off, like, you know, you come back to reality, and, you know, you got to go to work, and, like,
right.
You know, some things suck sometimes, like, c'est la vie. But I've been trying to be more intentional about, like, what can I take away from those really peak feelings that I have on drugs? Like, what learnings can I take materially, whether it's, you know, even just, like, senses of, like, a feeling, like, remembering how I felt, all the way to really actionable things about how I feel about certain things in my life, about certain relationships. And I've gotten, honestly, in a habit more recently about, whenever I'm on drugs and I have a thought that feels pretty profound, I'll just whip out the notes app on my phone and jot down some notes. And
oh yeah,
I don't do this all the time, but sometimes I feel really called to it. And dude, sometimes I will literally be in the middle of, like, a raging crowd at a rave, and I'll be on some psychedelic that really just gets my mind going. I'll just whip out my phone and just like type out some
Dude, I do the
notes,
same
man.
exact thing with the
And
Notes app. Like only when
oh
it really
yeah,
speaks to me though, or else I'm not
yeah.
like pulling out my phone.
Yeah, no, and honestly, some of my most profound like realizations and emotions I've experienced, learnings I've had, have been as a result of that process. So, if there's one thing you take away from this episode is if you're ever on drugs and you have a thought, like write it down, man, because no matter how much you think that you are going to remember it, you're not going to fucking remember it. Trust me, you're not going to remember it. Write that shit down. And honestly, I've been so impressed how even a short phrase that I put in my notes doc, like 3 words, will really reignite that like train of thought
The
in my
whole
mind.
thing.
Oh, like that's what I was thinking about. And it will really allow me to relive that thought, but in a completely sober state where it's like, okay, now I can actually remember it and process it in a way that is like, sober and potentially more useful for my life.
Right. And even if you're not going to forget it, just having it written down will just remind you of it and like reinforce that thought, which if it was really something that was like an epiphany to you, like that's what you want. So like write it down.
Hell yeah. Well, cool, man. I really enjoy a solid existential and philosophical conversation. I appreciate the topic, Reggie. And if you guys enjoyed hearing us talk about kind of this bigger picture stuff, please let us know. If you didn't, let us know as well. But we hope you guys enjoy the conversation. And that's today's pod. You've been listening to Modern Day Hippie. As you exit the portal, we have just one small ask of you. If you learned something new today, had a laugh, or resurfaced a drug story of your own, we want to hear about it. Drop us a comment on YouTube and show us some love on your favorite podcasting platforms. Internet algorithms really dog on us because of the topics that we discuss, so your support goes even further here than you might think. We'll catch you next week.